In the final months of 1941, as Europe burned and the Eastern Front swallowed millions of soldiers, a strange idea began to take shape inside Hitler's headquarters. An idea so enormous, so wildly impractical, that even his own generals hesitated to take it seriously. Hitler had always been fascinated with oversized machines, from railway guns longer than a football field to battleships larger than small towns. But now, with the war turning slowly against Germany, he convinced himself that victory would come not from strategy or logistics, but from a spectacle of engineering that would shock the world into submission. This obsession birthed one of the most extreme concepts of the entire war, a land battleship, a steel monster the size of an apartment block, capable of crushing cities beneath its tracks. It would weigh 1,000 tons, 4 times heavier than the largest tank Germany had ever put into service, and it would carry naval artillery normally used on warships. The idea was so audacious that Germany's armaments officials initially believed Hitler was exaggerating for dramatic effect. But he wasn't. He was entirely serious, and he demanded that engineers at Krupp begin drawing the first sketches immediately. The plan quickly transformed from rumor into a classified project code-named the Landkreuzer P-1000, a machine later nicknamed Ratte, the Rat, though ironically nothing about it was small or timid. Hitler believed this gigantic land fortress would roam across the Eastern Front like a steel titan, flattening Soviet bunkers, shrugging off artillery, and tearing open defensive lines simply by rolling forward. In his mind, it would restore the glory of the early Blitzkrieg days and show the world that German engineering could accomplish the impossible. And so, despite fuel shortages, material shortages, and a collapsing economy, the order was given: design the largest armored vehicle in human history. Even before a single bolt was tightened, the pressure inside Germany's armored military engineering community began to build. Some saw the project as madness. Others felt they were witnessing a new era of warfare, and in the shadows, a handful of officials prayed the idea would quietly die before it reached production. As the first sketches poured in, the sheer scale of Hitler's dream began to horrify even the most experienced engineers. The Ratte was projected to be 35 meters long, almost half a football field, and taller than a 3-story building. Its tracks alone were wider than a modern car, each one nearly 4 meters across, designed to distribute the staggering 1,000-ton weight. But even with these monstrous treads, the tank would crush most roads beneath it. The chassis needed to be thick enough to withstand direct hits from Soviet batteries, yet light enough that the vehicle could still move. This contradiction pushed designers into impossible calculations. The structure, when modeled on paper, bended under its own weight. If the Ratte stopped on soft soil, it would sink like a ship hitting mud. If it tried to cross a bridge, the bridge would collapse instantly. And if it tried to turn sharply, its massive hull might tear itself apart. But the orders kept coming. Find solutions, make it work, do not question the Führer's vision. Inside the drawing rooms at Krupp, engineers whispered their doubts in private, afraid to voice them publicly. The tank was supposed to be powered by modified submarine diesel engines, massive engines normally used to push giant vessels through the ocean. Even so, estimates suggested the fuel consumption would be catastrophic. At full throttle, the Ratte would burn more fuel in a single day than an entire armored division. But Hitler merely brushed off these concerns. He didn't care how much fuel it consumed. He cared about spectacle, intimidation, and scale. He imagined Soviet morale collapsing at the sight of a 1,000-ton Titan rolling across the battlefield. Whether it could turn, stop, or survive the terrain seemed secondary. His generals knew this was dangerous thinking, but in Nazi Germany, disagreeing with him was even more dangerous. And so, the blueprint advanced to the next stage, a stage where fantasy began colliding violently with physics. While most tanks carried cannons designed for ground combat, the Ratte was intended to carry the weapons of a warship. Engineers proposed mounting 2 full-size 280mm naval guns, the same artillery used on battleships like the Scharnhorst. These guns could fire shells weighing hundreds of kilograms, shells capable of demolishing fortresses or punching through armored formations from kilometers away. On top of that, the Rate would feature a 128mm secondary cannon, multiple anti-tank weapons, and as many as 8 anti-aircraft guns scattered across its hull. This wasn't a tank, it was a mobile artillery city. The turret alone weighed more than an entire Panzer IV tank. Housing such firepower meant the internal crew compartments resembled a small submarine, complete with ammunition rooms, loading stations, ventilation systems, and emergency bulkheads. The crew size was estimated at 40 to 41 men, though some analysts believed it would eventually need even more. However, this firepower came with crippling complications. Each naval shell required cranes and hydraulic systems to lift into place. The recoil of firing a battleship-sized gun from land raised alarming questions. On a ship, the water absorbed shock. On land, the force would travel directly into the chassis. Early calculations suggested that firing both main cannons at once might literally break the tank's frame. Engineers scrambled for solutions, proposing reinforced shock absorbers, redesigned loading chambers, and strengthened internal supports. Still, they could not guarantee the vehicle wouldn't shake itself apart during combat. The turret rotation alone demanded enormous power and space, meaning the interior became cramped, overheated, and dangerously complex. Yet Hitler pushed forward, imagining the Rate serving as a mobile fortress capable of taking on entire divisions. The reality, however, was becoming unavoidable. The bigger the design became, the more fragile it actually was. A tank this size faced a challenge far greater than guns, armor, or engineering, the Earth itself. Germany's landscape, its forests, hills, rivers, and marshes, was never designed to support a machine that weighed 1,000 tons. The Rot would sink into soft terrain, destroy paved roads, and carve permanent scars into the soil. Engineers estimated that even flat ground could collapse under the pressure of the massive treads. Rail transport was impossible. No train line could handle the weight. Shipping it by barge was equally unrealistic. For a vehicle meant to be mobile, the Rot was paradoxically immobile before it ever existed. And if it somehow reached the front, it would be an easy target for bombers. It could not hide, it could not retreat, it could barely maneuver. Turning radius calculations suggested it would need hundreds of meters of space to change direction. The Eastern Front was chaotic, muddy, cratered, and unpredictable. A machine that required ideal conditions to survive would not survive at all. Despite all this, Hitler insisted that the Rot would revolutionize ground warfare. He believed it would be a psychological weapon, pushing Soviet troops into panic simply by appearing on the horizon. But military commanders understood the bigger threat. It would become a liability. A single aircraft could cripple it. A mechanical failure could trap it forever. And if it broke down during an offensive, it would not just block a road. Its gigantic hull could block entire supply routes. Armored units would have to drive around it, losing momentum. Logistical officers shuddered at the thought of maintaining the beast. Spare parts would need to be custom forged at massive cost. Recovery vehicles didn't exist that could pull it. If it was disabled, it would have to be abandoned or blown up by its own crew. The deeper the planners looked, the clearer it became. The Rot was less a weapon and more a monument to impractical ambition, a colossal statue disguised as a tank. As 1942 turned into 1943, Germany's strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. The defeat at Stalingrad drained morale and resources. Fuel reserves were dwindling. Factories were being bombed. The Eastern Front demanded realistic, fast-produced weapons, not titanic experiments. Yet the Rate project kept consuming attention. Hitler continued asking for updates, imagining a future where the Landcruiser line included even larger vehicles, including a proposed P-1500 Monster, a self-propelled gun weighing 1,500 tons. Engineers working on the Ratte found themselves torn between duty and disbelief. They were being ordered to design a war machine at the exact moment Germany could barely produce normal tanks. And while their superiors smiled and nodded during meetings, many quietly hoped the project would collapse on its own. But Hitler's stubbornness ensured that the work continued longer than it should have, further draining time and energy that could have gone toward practical weapons. Meanwhile, Armaments Minister Albert Speer, who had taken over the increasingly desperate war economy, was fighting his own battle. Speer believed Germany needed efficiency, not spectacle. He reviewed the Ratte project and was stunned by its wastefulness. Every steel plate for this tank could build several standard tanks. Every hour spent designing it was an hour not spent improving mass production. Speer slowly began gathering political support to cancel the program, but he had to act carefully. Hitler viewed the Landcruiser as a symbol of dominance, not a weapon. Challenging it meant challenging his pride. Still, Speer understood the danger. If allowed to continue, the Ratte would become a black hole sucking vital resources from an already collapsing system. The question was no longer, can we build it, but can Germany survive trying? Inside the armaments offices, discussions about the Ratte grew increasingly tense. Engineers swapped grim jokes about how the tank would need its own postal code, or how a single breakdown would create a permanent landmark on the battlefield. But beneath the humor lay real fear. Speaking publicly against one of Hitler's pet projects was politically dangerous, yet the war was shifting. Practical officers like Guderian argued the army needed fast, maneuverable vehicles, not land battleships. Luftwaffe commanders warned that Allied air dominance made slow supertanks suicidal. Behind closed doors, some officials began slowing paperwork, delaying reports, or exaggerating technical obstacles. These subtle acts of resistance were not sabotage in the traditional sense. They were survival tactics within a bureaucracy where logic no longer guided decision-making. As the technical flaws accumulated, Speer finally made his move. He arranged a briefing that laid out every problem in cold, clinical detail. Mobility failures, fuel shortages, structural weaknesses, production impossibility, and catastrophic resource waste. To everyone's surprise, Hitler hesitated. He admired grand engineering, but even he couldn't ignore the country's shrinking capacity. The Eastern Front needed weapons now, not years from now. Under pressure, Hitler reluctantly allowed Speer to temporarily suspend the Landcruiser program until conditions improved. But in truth, Speer knew conditions would never improve enough. The suspension was a death sentence. He simply didn't announce it. The project faded quietly, without ceremony, buried under the weight of reality. Yet even then, in the bunker later in the war, Hitler still spoke occasionally of giant tanks that might have turned the tide, still trapped in the dream of machines too large to exist. Looking back, the Ratte was a perfect example of how extreme engineering can collapse under its own ambition. The physics were unforgiving. A 1,000-ton vehicle concentrated too much weight per square meter, even with broad tracks. The armor, no matter how thick, couldn't protect the tank from airstrikes, which became increasingly deadly by 1943. Its engines would overheat, overconsume fuel, and break under stress. Its internal layout was cramped, dangerous, and mechanically overstressed. Even if construction had begun, Germany would have needed massive facilities, gigantic cranes, and new transportation methods just to assemble it. And if all that somehow succeeded, deploying the Ratte would have been a nightmare. It couldn't cross rivers, couldn't maneuver through towns, and couldn't hide from reconnaissance. The moment it appeared on the battlefield, it would be surrounded from the air and destroyed in a spectacle of fire. But the most devastating flaw was strategic. Modern warfare was evolving towards speed, flexibility, and precision.
Tanks were no longer siege platforms, they were mobile spears. A super-heavy vehicle conflicted completely with this philosophy. The Rot represented a mindset stuck in the past, where brute size equaled dominance. But by the mid-1940s, dominance came from logistics, coordination, air support, and efficient production. The Rot, if built, would have been a slow-moving monument to outdated thinking. Its very existence would have drained fuel and steel from the Panzer divisions that Germany desperately needed. The tragedy of the project wasn't just its absurdity, it was that Germany spent real time and real resources chasing it, even as the war slipped further from its grasp.
When historians examine the Radet today, they see more than a blueprint. They see symbolism. They see the desperation of a regime that believed miracles could replace strategy. The Radet was never built, yet it remains one of the most famous what-if weapons of the war. Images of its design circulate online, its enormous turret and skyscraper-like profile capturing the imagination of enthusiasts. It appears in documentaries, video games, alternate history stories, and fantasy artwork. The idea of a 1,000-ton tank rolling across battlefields is undeniably captivating. But beneath that fascination lies a deeper truth. The project highlights how totalitarian systems can distort technology. When leaders demand impossibilities, engineers are forced into compliance even when physics screams no. The Radet survived not as a machine, but as a testament to how far ambition can drift from reality when unchecked. However, its legacy also offers valuable lessons. Modern militaries study the Radet as a warning about over-specialization and over-engineering. The biggest weapon is not always the best weapon. Flexibility matters more than spectacle. Logistical sustainability matters more than symbolic power. The Radet was the product of a mindset that believed fear, intimidation, and scale were decisive factors in war. But history proved otherwise. Victory came through efficiency, coordination, and adaptability. Today, the Radet stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder that size alone cannot win battles, and that engineering brilliance must be grounded in practicality, not fantasy. While the Radet never left the drawing board, imagining its deployment reveals even more of its impracticality. Suppose Germany had poured its dwindling resources into constructing the beast. The assembly alone would take years, requiring enormous facilities that were constantly bombed by Allied aircraft. Once completed, transporting it to a front line would be nearly impossible. Roads would collapse, bridges would fail. The Allies would detect it immediately from aerial reconnaissance. Every bomber within range would target it relentlessly. Anti-tank guns might struggle to penetrate its thick armor, but armor is worthless when fire rains from above. A swarm of aircraft could destroy its exposed systems, engines, and fuel tanks. Even immobile, the Radet would become a gigantic burning landmark. If defended by anti-aircraft guns, the tank would still be overwhelmed by superior numbers. A single mechanical failure during battle would trap it permanently, forcing its crew to abandon or sabotage it to prevent capture.
Strategically, the Rat would become the equivalent of a stranded battleship far from the ocean, impressive to look at, but destined for rapid destruction. Worse, its construction would starve Germany's tank divisions of materials. Thousands of tons of steel, millions of liters of fuel, and thousands of workers would be diverted away from producing practical equipment. The resulting drain could accelerate Germany's defeat. In this alternate timeline, the Rat becomes the ultimate example of misused resources, a weapon so large that it breaks everything around it, including the nation trying to build it. This thought experiment reveals the truth. The Rat didn't fail because Germany lacked skill.
It failed because the concept itself violated the laws of warfare, engineering, and reality. The story of Hitler's 1,000-ton tank is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a window into the final stage of a collapsing regime, where dreams grew as resources shrank, and fantasy replaced strategy. Germany in the early 1940s was battling multiple fronts, losing fuel, losing manpower, and losing time. Yet Hitler demanded weapons that looked powerful, rather than weapons that performed powerfully. The Rat was the peak of this delusion, a project that consumed thought but produced nothing. It showed how leadership built on ego can push entire industries toward dead ends. And it demonstrated how engineers, even brilliant ones, can become trapped in systems where questioning authority is more dangerous than designing the impossible. The Rat lives on today not as a machine, but as a metaphor. The bigger the dream, the heavier the fall. The truth is simple. Had Germany focused on practical weapons instead of superweapons, the war might have unfolded differently. But dictators rarely learn from limits. They push until the world collapses around them. The Rat was the ultimate expression of that mindset, grand, intimidating, and doomed from the moment it was conceived. In the end, it serves as a reminder of something essential. The most dangerous enemy in any war is not the opposing army, but the fantasies leaders choose to believe. And in Hitler's fantasy, a 1,000-ton tank would rewrite history. In reality, it became a symbol of why his vision was destined to fail.